We've hit a point where two groups of people can watch the exact same video of a woman being killed and walk away with completely opposite stories about what happened. What struck me about the Renee Good killing wasn't just the brutality of the act itself. It was the official response and then the comment sections afterward.
Everybody who's been repeating the lie that this is some innocent woman who was out for a drive in Minneapolis when a law enforcement officer shot at her, you should be ashamed of yourselves.
People aligned with the current regime looked at the same footage and saw obvious self-defense, obvious necessity. People outside that orbit saw an obvious execution by the state. And that's not normal political disagreement. That's not like I like higher taxes and you like lower taxes. That's a fracture in what counts as empirical reality, what counts as a fact. Historically, that kind of split shows up in pretty dark places. So you can think of the stab in the back myth in Weimar Germany, where a huge chunk of the population insisted that Germany hadn't really lost World War I. It had been betrayed from within. Or the lost cause narrative after the U.S. Civil War, where an entire region retold slavery as benign and the Confederacy as noble against mountains of evidence. And in each case, the point wasn't just we disagree on policy, it was we live in different worlds about what happened. And that's the kind of break the Renee Good reaction is signaling now. So the question isn't just, was this shooting justified? And in my view, it was unequivocally not justified. It's what does it mean for a democracy when lethal force by the state becomes an optical test for entirely separate realities? So what if the core political divide isn't actually left versus right, but people who can tolerate ambiguity and discomfort versus people who can't? A lot of research on authoritarianism finds the same pattern, which is people with authoritarian leanings tend to have very low tolerance for ambiguity. They want clear hierarchies, simple rules, and sharp boundaries between us and them. Ambiguous situations, new norms around gender, shifting racial hierarchies, changing demographics don't just feel confusing, they feel threatening. That internal panic gets externalized as a demand to make the world simpler again. Get rid of the strange people, shut down the confusing practices, and punish the ones who break the old script. In a pluralistic democracy, difference and ambiguity are baked into the cake. You're always encountering people, beliefs, and bodies that don't fit your template. For some people, that's uncomfortable but manageable. For others, it's almost intolerable. And that's where you start to see attraction to strong men, purges, and fantasies of cleansing violence. So when we talk about a temperamental minority that can't easily live in pluralism, that's what we mean. Not that they're evil by nature, but that their nervous systems are constantly screaming, make this stop, when they encounter ambiguity or discomfort. Without emotional regulation skills and self-insight, which, let's admit, most adults struggle with, but this temperament in particular, this can easily cause major issues inside a diverse society that is constantly changing. There's a brutal little paradox at the heart of any free society, and that's if you tolerate people who want to end tolerance, you eventually lose the whole thing. Can a democracy safely include people who fundamentally don't believe in democracy? At some point, the answer has to be not without limits. Karl Popper called this the paradox of tolerance. A fully tolerant society, he said, cannot be tolerant of movements that seek to destroy tolerance itself.
Was ich bei der offenen Gesellschaft gemeint habe, war eine Gesellschaft, sagen wir, in der man frei atmen kann, frei denken kann, in der jeder Mensch einen Wert hat und in der die Gesellschaft keine überflüssigen Zwänge über die Menschen ausübt.
That doesn't mean that you put people in prison for bad opinions. It means you draw hard lines around actions and organized projects. Post-war Germany is a good example of this. It bans explicitly Nazi parties and can dissolve groups that aimed to overthrow the democratic order, precisely because it learned what happens when you let anti-pluralist movements capture the state. In the US context, that's the unresolved problem. We've treated "it's just another opinion" and "it's an organized attempt to end democracy" as if they belong in the same bucket, when they don't. One can be tolerated, the other, if you let it run, will eventually shut down everyone else's voices. So the real question isn't, should we tolerate people we disagree with? Of course we should. The real question is, where do we draw the line when a movement's explicit or implicit goal is to eliminate the possibility of disagreement at all? When we get to the other side of this, the hardest problem maybe won't be rewriting the laws. It'll be living with a permanent minority that struggles to function in a pluralistic world. When this project eventually collapses, as authoritarian projects tend to, we'll still be left with a sizable minority whose psychological profile doesn't magically change. They will still struggle with ambiguity and still prefer rigid hierarchies and still feel existentially threatened by visible difference. That means any viable after has to do at least 3 things. The first is to build hard legal and institutional limits so that anti-pluralist movements can't easily seize the state again, as post-war Germany has done. The second is that we need to invest early and deeply in teaching ambiguity tolerance, how to live with discomfort without immediately reaching for elimination. Third, create exit ramps for people who are leaving authoritarian spaces that don't require them to endure total humiliation or social death, because if the only options are domination or annihilation, people will cling to domination. This is not to excuse the harm that these people have done and are doing. Anyone committing crimes and atrocities should be held fully accountable. But for those who want to get off the rage carousel, there should be ways to do that don't feel like total psychological extinction. None of that is clean or easy, but it's more honest. The project isn't just stop this, it's how do we design a society that can survive with a permanent, fearful anti-pluralist minority without letting that fear run the whole show again.